Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's Mr. White. Sorry I couldn't be here today, but of course I've got your notes all ready to go. You know I wouldn't let you go a day without notes. So go ahead and get out that note sheet. The teacher should have given you a note sheet. You're just going to fill in the blanks as we go through these notes. And today we're going to talk about a little something called the business cycle. The business cycle refers to the fluctuations in our economy over time. So the business cycle shows how our productivity rises and falls from one year to the next. And if you remember, the way that we measure productivity in our economy is GDP. That's right. We measure our productivity with GDP. GDP shows how much stuff we're producing. And so sometimes the amount of stuff we're producing is rising. Sometimes the amount of stuff we're producing is falling. And sometimes there's a brief moment where the amount of stuff we're producing pauses, so it's not rising or falling. And these are the different phases of the business cycle. So as you can see on your paper and on this graph, on the y-axis of the business cycle, we've got the level of real GDP. So I'll go ahead and circle that for you right over here. Hey, here's our real GDP. Down across the x-axis, we've got an amount of time. Okay, so it just shows how real GDP changes over time. So let's go through each phase of this business cycle and talk about what's going on. The first phase of the business cycle is called the trough phase. Now I know that looks like tro, but as you can see, it's actually pronounced trough. So pretend like it's spelled T-R-O-F-F, even though it's clearly spelled differently than that. All right, so what the trough means is that the economy has bottomed out. In other words, this is the lowest that our GDP is going to go. Whenever we're in the trough phase, that is generally when we have the highest level of unemployment. So if you think about the height of the Great Depression, thinking roughly like 1932, 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States got up to about 25%. That was the highest unemployment rate we got. But that meant that once it hit 25%, it wasn't rising anymore. So one important thing to realize about the trough is that unemployment stops rising when we hit the trough phase. And the trough phase is also when GDP stops falling. So unfortunately, the trough being the worst part of our economy, this is also when we see a lot of businesses that start closing down. So by 1933, 1934, there were way fewer businesses in the United States than there had been in 1929, mostly because throughout the contraction and then the trough phase of the business cycle, many of those businesses had to close. Now, after we're at the bottom, that's the lowest we can go. I believe Drake once said, started from the bottom, now we're here. Okay. Once you're at the bottom, the only way you can go is up, and so that's what we call the expansion phase. Now, because of the fact that the expansion phase comes right after the trough, that's why an expansion phase is also sometimes referred to as a recovery. Now, during this time, the economy is growing. You might remember that I told you the other day, economic growth just means that we're producing more stuff than before. And a lot of the times it's essential that we develop new technology in order for that to happen. Better technology means that we can produce more stuff, we can produce it faster and at a lower cost. And so generally, that makes everything more available for people to buy and usually cheaper for them to buy too. And so that's why you can see, like during the expansion phase, we would expect to see way more consumption going on. Like in this picture right here, you can see this huge line of people at Target buying a bunch of stuff. That's what we would expect to see in the expansion phase. So when people start demanding more stuff, businesses start producing more stuff. And so that means our real GDP starts to rise. As real GDP rises, and as businesses produce more stuff, they need to utilize more factors of production. It just makes sense that if you're going to produce more stuff, you probably need more capital, you probably need more land, and of course, you need more labor. So that's why the unemployment rate falls during the expansion phase. As our businesses produce more, they need more workers, so more people get jobs. When more people get jobs, more people get money. And that explains why there's an increase in consumption. Remember that consumption just means when households are buying stuff that they want and need. And so if everybody gets more money, everybody gets more of the stuff that they want and need. And as more people demand this stuff, that causes businesses to expand. Businesses may have to open a new location, they may have to hire a lot more workers, they may have to upgrade their machines and their tools, because more demand means more production, and more production means more GDP growth. Now after the growing stops, because of course we can't grow forever, we hit what's called the peak of the business cycle. At the peak of the business cycle, GDP is no longer growing. It's when the GDP stops growing. And when GDP stops growing, that means that the unemployment rate stops falling. Because if businesses aren't producing more, they don't need to keep hiring people. And so for a brief moment in time, we're going to see sort of a pause happen on our economic growth. Now, the nice thing about being at the peak of the business cycle is that there's widespread prosperity, meaning that everybody's generally doing really good. So if you're trying to picture what that might look like, just think about the Roaring 20s. You know, towards the end of the Roaring 20s, like 1928, 1929, we were at the peak of the business cycle. Everybody was doing good. There was lots of money. Think like that book, The Great Gatsby. Hopefully you read that last year. If you didn't read that last year, then maybe at least you read the Cliff Notes. And you might remember that like everybody had a lot of money. There were parties all the time. Everybody was having a good time. Now, the downside, though, is that at the peak of the business cycle, sales are at their highest level. So businesses are selling a lot of stuff, which leads to a lot of demand pull inflation. You may remember we just talked about inflation when prices are rising. So even though things are good during the expansion phase and the peak phase of the business cycle, it's important to remember that those are the times when prices are most likely to rise very rapidly. The higher that prices go, the harder it is for businesses and households to continue buying stuff. And so a lot of the times, the high inflation that we see during the peak leads to the next phase, which is called the contraction phase, also known as the recession phase. Now, it's important to know that a contraction of the business cycle, when GDP is falling, is only considered a recession if it lasts for 6 months in a row or longer. In other words, if GDP is only falling for like 2 months, we don't call it a recession, we just call it a contraction of the business cycle. But if GDP is falling for 8 months, then we call it a recession. So you might have heard of that term recession before. We just had a recession back in 2008. What happens during a recession is that businesses stop producing as much. When businesses don't produce as much, they don't need as many workers anymore. And generally, since workers are the most expensive factor of production that businesses have to pay for, workers are the first factor of production that businesses cut back on when their sales go down. So as business sales decrease, production decreases, and also unemployment starts to increase. So generally the contraction phase of the business cycle is the worst time. During the contraction phase or the recession phase of the business cycle, we see a lot more cyclical unemployment. You may remember we talked about the different kinds of unemployment. We said there's like frictional unemployment, which is the good kind, where people are taking their time to find the best job, not just any job. We said structural unemployment is when people lost their job because the way we do things in the economy is different. Like remember the switch from Blockbuster to Netflix. But then that other kind, cyclical unemployment, happens when there's a downturn in the whole economy. So the kind of unemployment that we see increasing during a contraction or in the trough phase of the business cycle is what we would refer to as cyclical unemployment. And so now you can understand where that word cyclical comes from. It's caused by a downturn of the business cycle. Make sense? Okay, good. Now, it's important to know how we measure the business cycle. The business cycle is measured from trough to trough. And generally, going from trough to trough takes about 5 to 7 years. So you might expect that every decade we're going to have at least one contraction of the business cycle. And if that contraction is really severe, we would go ahead and call that a recession of the business cycle. Now, you might be asking me, well, Mr. White, we learned all about this thing called the Great Depression. What was the Great Depression? Well, a depression is a recession that lasts for 2 years in a row or longer. Luckily, we haven't had any depressions since 1929 up till about 1940. Okay, that was the Great Depression because as you can see, that was like 10 years of GDP growth falling. The closest we've come to another depression was in 2008. But luckily, because of the fact that our government and the banks reacted very quickly, we were able to avoid another depression and we only just had a great recession. So if you want to look at what the business cycle of the United States looks like in real life, this is a graph. You can see it doesn't look exactly like the business cycle we've been looking at, but this is because the business cycle we were looking at is mostly like a theoretical thing. But on here you can see the exact same stuff that we were talking about just a minute ago. Over on our y-axis we have the GDP of the United States in billions of dollars. And the year that we're using as our base year to calculate real GDP is the year 2012. So what you can see is going all the way back to the year 2000, which was like a year or two before y'all were born, the GDP of the United States was right around, let's say, $13,000 billion, which is $13 trillion. When you guys were born, you'll notice that there's like this gray mark right here. Hopefully everybody can see that little gray area, okay? This gray area here denotes a contraction of the business cycle. And you can see that at the end of 2001, right around 9/11, up until right around the beginning of 2002, we had a little mini contraction of the business cycle. But since that contraction only lasted about 4 months, we didn't call it a recession, we just called it a contraction. Then you can see that through all the years when y'all were babies, up until the time when you were maybe in like middle school, around the time when Barack Obama was elected, we were having an expansion phase of the business cycle. You can see that our real GDP is rising. And so that by the time we hit 2008, our real GDP was a little bit below $16 trillion. But then you'll notice something happened right here. This is that Great Recession. You can see that we had a big time downturn in our GDP. Real GDP drops, and when real GDP drops, we call that a recession. But ever since then, 2010 all the way up until now, back into the expansion phase again. Okay, so guys, what you need to do now is go ahead, go on Google Classroom, look for the one called Business Cycle Worksheet, and that's what I need you to try to complete before the end of class. It's due for a daily grade by next Tuesday. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Have a great day.